Hei og velkommen til Skeiv dagsorden. Dette er podcasten hvor Thea og Mariann fra Senter for likestilling prater om aktuelle skeive saker. Hei og velkommen til denne episoden av Skeiv dagsorden. I dag skal episoden være på engelsk, så jeg kommer til å switche over til engelsk nå. Because we have Bill and Eric in the studio today. Hi.
Hi.
Welcome. And thank you so much for saying yes to our request to join us.
Thank you for having us.
To start off, can you tell me a bit about yourselves? First, Eric, would you like to start?
Sure. Come from USA, United States, 40 years old, mostly normal schooling, didn't complete college, worked as a pharmacy technician, which is an assistant under a pharmacist for 15 years in two different scenarios. So one in person, just like a regular apothec, and then one as a mail order, where I largely fixed computer issues, really. Related to pharmacy, but mainly fixing computer issues through an automated system. Met Bill online. We lived long distance for a long time until we came here, really. We had a few stints of staying with each other for about a month, but some issues with getting jobs near each other, or jobs. At one point, we were looking at just kind of converging in one place, and we still couldn't get responses there. So we stayed long distance for a while before we finally were able to combine and then come here.
Thank you. Bill?
I'm 45, and I'm from the northeast part of the U.S., just north of Washington, D.C. I have experience as an organist and professional musician. I've worked in churches, I've given recitals, and I've taught for about the past 20 years or so. So we really love it here in Norway.
Yeah, you do?
Yeah, we do. We really do. Yeah, vi elsker Norge.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect. What a great start. And the reason why we have invited you here to our podcast is, of course, the wonderful article about you in KRS Avis, which we talked about a few episodes back in Norwegian. So I don't know if you have been able to hear it on our podcast, but we talked about it in a previous episode. And we have invited you because you have moved from the US
Yes.
to Norway this summer.
Correct.
Yeah, just a few months back. And just a little bit from the beginning, why did you decide to leave the US in the first place?
During the first Trump presidency, we began to see signs of increased oppression towards the LGBTQ community. And in the beginning, it was very small signs, but then it became more transparent that this was an oppression that was going to continue to drive forward and to target larger groups of people. When Trump was elected on November 5th, I believe it was November 5th of last year, Eric and I said to ourselves, we can't stay here. It's not going to be safe for us. While it may seem safe now, we've seen this play out in history before, and we know what happens. So we need to make a plan. Do we move to a democratic city in the U.S.? Do we go overseas? And of course, it was difficult for us to find jobs, as Eric said. So I began looking for work here in Norway, and I found it. So we decided to come.
Mm-hmm. And the thing that you said about moving to a more democratic city in the US, are there major differences between states, between cities in the US when we talk about legislation?
There can be. And also, we specifically said a big democratic city when we were talking about it because they needed power. I come from Houston, and I lived in Houston. Houston is extremely powerful. Even as big as Texas is, Houston still has a humongous amount of its economy. A part of Texas is from that. And it's allowed them to be protected to some degree, that the state doesn't want to interfere with that. And so they allow Houston to be Houston because of that. But they were starting to seemingly not care anymore, and they were going to start clamping on that. So we were kind of looking at big democratic cities in blue states to kind of prevent that interference. And so there's not too many that are very large, but you wanted them to be large for economic power because it makes them less likely to be interfered with and also have more able to pressure outside of it. And then we also just wanted the state to not want to interfere in it much. And they can be pretty large differences. The federal government has a significant amount of power in the states, but the state level still has a lot as well. Because of the way the federal government has to make laws, it's kind of a dance that it always has to be in relation to multiple states. They can't just make it in relation to one. It has to be related to interstate commerce or some indirect manner of it being interstate commerce, or affect how states interact with each other. Like both states need to recognize each other's marriage licenses or driver's licenses or things like that. So that's what the federal government is supposed to only be able to interact with. So everything else is kind of left up to the states. They've blurred that lines a lot over the past 200 years, but that's its general idea. And because of that, the states can end up very different from each other. The previously, marriage between same-sex couples was allowed in some states and not in others, which was problematic again because states are supposed to recognize each other's marriages, and that's where the court cases came from. So they can vary very wildly in what's allowed and what's not allowed. And that can also affect people who are federal workers, because their insurance and how it interacts. You can have strange situations like same-sex couples in a state that doesn't allow same-sex marriage. So that's where it got a little strange. But they can be very different from each other, very different in how they tax, very different in who they tax. And particularly, we don't have kids, but school systems are almost always better in blue states.
Yep. Because we have, of course, seen, for example, examples from Florida, which have been very restrictive in relation to LGBTQ rights. Mm-hmm. So there can be major differences between states as well, which is quite different from how it's like in Norway, for such a small country, of course, compared to the States. But yeah. Did you feel that your rights or safety were being threatened in like a direct way by the Trump administration and the federal government? So
I would say at the moment we're cis, we're white, and we're male. So, and not that it matters as much in the States anymore, but I was raised Protestant, so I would be the highest echelon, because there's actually different classes of whites in the United States. So we weren't being affected yet, but we knew eventually they would run out of other people, and they would eventually come for progressively larger groups of people. They would start with the smallest, with trans people, or the people with the least amount of voices, which are immigrants and undocumented immigrants. But they would eventually run out of those people, or maybe the fervor wouldn't be as strong for them anymore, and they'd have to move on to more and more people to oppress, because it's part of the kind of the totalitarian playbook.
Before we moved to Norway, I was living in a town north of Washington, D.C. It was, I would say, about 20,000 people, so it was a very small town. But when Trump came to power, we began seeing pickup trucks with Trump flags on the back, increased rhetoric, Trump bumper stickers, Trump signs in yards. And I knew deep down that if my neighbors knew who I was, that it would be a problem. My landlady at the time knew. Her husband was a staunch Trump supporter, and we kept our distance, but I knew deep down he didn't like me. So that was part of the reason, knowing that in rural America, where communities tend to be more conservative as opposed to urban areas, that the climate was changing in a way that it would not be safe in the future.
So he really also, Trump, went after also the more liberal states, and to promote himself with bumper stickers and trailers, and to get into those states as well?
I suppose it started just as the political movement, as most political parties advertise themselves. But then it began to take the hallmarks of a more cultish.
I see.
Of a more cultish organization, where people began to identify themselves with the movement, and they became inextricably linked with the movement. So that's where the concern was coming from.
Yeah.
And you also started to get the thing that you get in cults, where there's also people who don't necessarily believe in the movement, but they recognize that if they don't at least pretend or start putting these things up so that everyone else can know, then they might not be safe either. So you start to get sort of that thing as well. There are people who might put Trump things on that they wouldn't normally be that political, or they wouldn't advertise it, or maybe culturally, particularly where I was from, generally you didn't talk about who you voted for. Talking about politics wasn't a good thing, but suddenly it became increasingly talked about, and it wasn't just that people who are more progressive or liberal were suddenly talking about it, and that's where these conversations came from. It was coming from, oftentimes, from the more conservative side. And so there were people who were entering into the kind of pretend game. They think other people are part of the group, and so they want to at least pretend to be part of the group so they're protected. But truthfully, no one's part of the group. They're just all pretending towards each other.
Yeah.
But his area was more rural, and that's always the outside of the cities has always been more conservative in general. They're somewhat more distrusting of government in general. Kind of ironic because conservatives have moved towards obviously larger and more powerful governments, but they've also always felt that they were left behind. So there's this kind of like loner attitude or outside attitude that they've always been attracted to those things. And even if a state is blue in its totality, it's outside rural areas, it's farming lands, those tend to be conservative in general.
And would you say it's more polarized than ever in the US?
Mhm.
Yeah. And you can see it like loud and clear.
I have family members I can't talk to anymore because the tension is so high. Family gatherings would not be possible because there would be arguments and there would be fights and nothing physical, of course, but it would be tense enough that we just wouldn't want to have those conversations.
I can see why. When it's so polarized, you can't even, and politics will become such a play a big part as well when it's so polarized. So it's difficult to talk about. Talking about the political climate in the US, and how did it affect your daily life? You have already talked a bit about that, and a sense of belonging in your own country. I saw Bill in the article in Queres Avis about your job. If you were open on your workplace, that will have consequences for you.
Yes. At the time, I was working for a church where the pastor was a Trump supporter. And he was saying things like, I think they should build the wall to keep the illegal immigrants out, which seems so anti-gospel to me. But at the same time, he wrote a very homophobic letter to the parishioners about the immorality of the LGBTQ community and how we're infiltrating all parts of society. And
that sounds very Trump-ish.
Very Trumpish, that he had a fear that we would be taking over. So I couldn't wear my wedding ring to church. I could only tell a very select group of people who I really was. So it was exhausting.
Bill, also because of the nature of health insurance and things like that, and typically it's gotten through your work in the States. It also meant that Bill couldn't be on my insurance, even though I worked for the largest insurance provider in the States, so I had probably one of the best insurances there, even though it would have been better for him, even though we weren't married too long during that time, it would have been better for him to switch to my insurance than his own, even with oftentimes there's a penalty for that. Even with the penalty, it still would have been cheaper for him to have done that. But we couldn't because they would know. And then they, because of the First Amendment, good and bad, they'd be able to fire him because of that, because they're a religious organization. I also think it's important to note that the congregation did not respond positively to that letter. I think most of them didn't. One, knew plenty of people from the LGBTQ community, but also I think the rest may have just, it wasn't something that they really worried about. So they were not happy with his letter that he had sent out. So that was at least some sort of comfort, but not much.
There's so many consequences that we can't even begin to think about here in our society in Norway. And we think about like the US, like a big, powerful country, you know, the American dream, the whole cliche of America. And that has really changed in the last just a few years.
Yes.
It's crazy to think about. Are there any changes in law or policies that concern you more than others in the States right now? What the Trump administration, what groups they're going after, or
So at first, I wasn't particularly concerned about a lot of them because a lot of them weren't written very well. And while I'm not a lawyer, I have at least enough experience to see the ones that are written well enough that aren't going to get it immediately thrown out. Because even if a good judge is conservative, they oftentimes have a love of the law. And if something isn't done properly, that love of the law is the most important thing to them. And so they don't allow it anyway. But that has started to fade to some degree as more and more things go through, and as we get cases from the highest court in the land of saying certain things can go through. And they're doing it, and this happens oftentimes in states' law, in vague ways that allows more people to file lawsuits, even though they may not go through because it's not necessarily what the Supreme Court meant. It allows them to get further than they would previously, and just putting out so many laws over and over again, spending taxpayer money over and over again, eventually something will push through that's well written enough, that's gone through the thing enough that it'll just get passed. I don't know if it's necessarily one thing. There are sometimes that there are concerning things that I think it's concerning not just for LGBTQ people, but law in general. Like, if I recall, Idaho had filed a lawsuit as a state saying that its rights had been violated based on the marriage law, which seemed strange because it doesn't sound like they have any standing. You need an actual harm to be caused, and there's no harm to the state by just having to give out marriage licenses. So, because it's what they're supposed to do. So that seemed very strange. If that one progresses further, that's bad on a lot of levels. I haven't kept up with that one though. But there's been a bunch in general that are filed everywhere. A lot of them are just, they're laws that are written that they know are not going to stand up in court, but they're written because it gets them, their constituents riled up, or it gets them to follow them more. The Texas, this is not LGBTQ, but it is somewhat related. The Texas abortion ban that became like a big thing there was very much a what we say in the States is a dog catches car moment, where they wrote it, but they didn't expect it to pass because none of those have passed in the past. And actually that law had originally come from a council, like a city council, that a Republican member had submitted it because he knew that his opponent, who was also Republican, couldn't pass it without crippling himself politically. And so he intentionally engineered this thing to be introduced into the council to cause it to hurt his opponent. But somebody then took it to the state level and somehow it passed, which most people were really surprised by. But it was maybe just kind of a sign of the times. And then from there, of course, the court case said that it was legal, and everyone was also very surprised by that. But all of that, a lot of this is just a dance. It's theater. They're putting out these laws to look good to their constituents, but they don't actually expect them to pass. They don't actually expect these things. They aren't worried about consequences because they don't think they'd ever matter. So a lot of these laws popped up and passed, and were able to go through the court system, getting affirmed, that they didn't expect to ever, because it's just politicians trying to play a political game, and they end up like doing something they didn't expect to actually happen. That's not to say they're good people or that they actually care about the outcome necessarily, but they didn't expect it to actually matter.
I see.
They thought that they were just going to be able to do things as business as usual, but the politics had changed. The court system had changed.
Okay. Because I think maybe we have seen like the US, like, I don't know if perfect is the right word to use here, but the perfect example that your rights can be taken away from you in any given moment, like from one day to another. Any thoughts on that? Just like for the few days after, in January, after Trump was formally president, pen on a piece of paper, and for example, trans rights were gone just by that action.
One of the things that President Trump was doing was issuing executive orders, which was a right of presidents in the past, to essentially establish not a law, but a proclamation of an opinion.
In a way, what they're supposed to be is just what their namesake is they're supposed to be orders to the executive. But you can kind of make sort of laws by doing it in certain ways. Now, he doesn't appear to be doing it that way. He appears to be casting laws, making straight up laws out of them, which is very odd. But you could say, do something like, we're no longer going to prosecute people for possessing marijuana. That could be something that an executive order could say, and you're not changing the law, but you're saying that the executive is no longer going to prosecute it. So it's officially, it's not legalized, but it's not criminalized any longer.
Okay.
So that's what an executive order is supposed to be. It's supposed to be an order to the executive to do something. But American culture, right or wrong, has kind of started to associate them with being able to pass laws, not just orders to the executive. So saying that insurance providers, well, you could do this two different ways. If you said insurance providers have to pay for birth control, or you could say that insurance providers who take federal funds have to pay for birth control. The second one might be possible because of you're controlling, as the executive, while you don't control necessarily where the funds go, you can kind of control how they're used to a certain degree once they're allocated in a certain way. So that one, the second one would be more likely as a possible executive order. But the first one is you trying to write a law with the executive order, and that should be immediately taken by a court and said, no, this is impossible. But kind of a thing where like Americans have started to think that they're able to do that. And because they think they're able to do that, they might become able to do that.
So it works either way.
Yes.
In some way.
So it might actually start to function that way.
So the suppression of, for example, trans people, it works because Trump.
So we've seen executive orders targeting how trans people use restrooms, how trans folks are able to participate in sports, and how trans folks are represented in history and in literature and in our classrooms. So it's obvious that the goal of the Trump administration is to push that out of the mind's eye so that the trans folks are no longer in existence. But of course, we know that trans folks have always been here, and they always will be here.
It's quite scary, the whole thing. I think sitting here on the other side of the Atlantic, looking over to the US, because we have seen like the rhetoric from the Trump administration have been in some ways adopted in Norway as well. Like, the trans ideology, teaching kids about queer people is dangerous. All the things that Trump is saying and other American people as well. We see the same rhetoric in Norway here now as well. But thankfully, the federal government has not jumped on that train just yet. But we have to keep fighting.
Yes.
Did you consider any other countries than Norway when you decided to leave? Or what made you choose Norway?
We had considered Spain as a possibility since Eric has a friend who lives there and is also an expat. We had considered Germany, but given the political push toward the right with ADF, it was... Is it ADF?
Yeah, it is.
ADF. So that seemed a little concerning, but a friend of mine with whom I went to university said that Norway was looking for organists.
Oh.
And I thought, sure, yeah, I can't get paid in the US to be an organist. How would I ever get paid in Norway to be an organist? But I checked out the political landscape here and your position in the environment and support for the general population, and we thought it would be a great place to live. So I applied and I got a job, and we said, let's get out of here.
Yeah, we had some more involved conversations about the different places we were looking at, Spain, Germany, and then Norway. And one of them was that as we were confident that Donald Trump, I have to be careful, I oftentimes call him Donnie.
Sorry.
Yeah, Donnie T. We assumed he would immediately remove funding to Ukraine, and Ukraine would fall to Russia, and we thought that Europe would be embroiled in a war, possibly. We also wanted to think about places that economically do okay during war, that people aren't going to be starving or things like that, or that suddenly his job isn't going to disappear, or things that nature. And I mean, historically, Spain hasn't done great. And then the political situation in Germany, because at the time, this was before the March elections, when it seemed they hadn't gone as far as people were worried. So we looked at Norway, who seems to just kind of keep going along during times of turmoil. And they also were somewhat distanced. Maybe, I mean, obviously we're at the very tip. We have a Russian touch, but somewhat distanced and economically strong, and things of that were things we were also looking at too. And luckily, also Bill had a friend who lived here as well, who had mentioned it. So that was kind of our final thing. The only awkward part is like the reason why we were looking at Spain and Germany also is I have a little bit of Spanish because of growing up in Texas. And Bill has German because of his schooling. So that's why we were looking at the two places also. But we obviously had no Norwegian at all. Although, I mean, many words are shared because either we borrowed from Norwegian, English borrowed from Norwegian, or a Norwegian borrowed from English. So it is kind of fun of me asking a word, what's this word for this? And it's the same word.
Yeah, many similar words, yeah. Do you have had any thoughts on the attitudes against LGBTQ plus people in Norway yet during the last few months? Any?
The only thing I can say is that compared to living in the US, I feel, and I think Eric would agree with me, that we feel completely safe here. We could walk down the street and have no fear of any kind of altercation. Of course, also in the US, folks aren't walking down the street and being accosted for being gay. That's not what's happening. But we know that I am welcomed at the Valkyrka, where I work. We know that the community is supportive, and we know that we are safe.
Although it is important to note that there are people being accosted in the States, in the stores. Oddly enough, particularly cis women, when they think that they're trans, seem to be taking the brunt of a lot of things. Not that the trans women should be taking things either, but those are definitely happening in stores. The violence for trans women has always been somewhat high, so I don't know if we know the full scope of the increase. So it may be just hard to measure, really. So far, I imagine it's increased. You can't just talk about people being less than human or like not worthy or things like that and not expect folks to act out against them in some capacity. Certainly in a nation of 300 million, someone's going to do it.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you like it here in Kristiansand and in Norway and that you feel safe. I wouldn't want you to have to move from the US in the first place, but yeah. Is there anything in particular that you would think people in Norway should understand about the current situation in the US?
I think it's important to remember that the United States went through for a long period of being the place where people lived in a fairy tale almost. Everything was possible in America. You could be anything in America. America was the land of pursuing all of your dreams and hopes and desires. But even in America, this has happened. And this could happen in Norway too, if people aren't careful. It can happen anywhere. So I would just advise Norwegians to be wary and to be careful and to look ahead and to do what's good for us now and what's good for the generations to come.
I would also maybe say, just as a word of caution, that America has a lot of advantages. It has a lot of inherent resources. It certainly has a large population. It has a lot of advantages. This happening now, I think, has been a long time coming, like a long time. I think if it were to occur at a lot of other places, it would happen much more quickly. It would happen faster. It would not take 40 years. It would take 10 or 5 or maybe even faster. The switch could happen even faster. It's taken a long time for America to realize that, its workers to realize, oh, we aren't getting paid like we did 30 years ago, 40 years ago. We aren't getting paid in this way. They haven't quite realized that it's the ultra wealthy that have been taking it and that the investment in the infrastructure and in the schooling and the future has been what's causing this. The things that they're scared of, which has led them to be manipulated. But it can happen anywhere. They're very much human. Their fear is very much a human thing, and their ability to be manipulated by it is very much. And it's a reason why we can see very almost one-to-one comparisons and historical things, because this is a human behavior. It is a thing that we end up doing in situations of strife and or perceived strife. We end up lashing out, and if someone comes up with a solution and they can blame a group of people that's a minority group that maybe a lot of people don't know, that's especially important, because the more people who know trans people and LGBTQ in general, the less likely they're going to want to do these things because they know someone. Then that helps, and that's part of why Pride was so important. It's just like, hey, we're human, but it can happen anywhere, and it might be faster. It might not be as slow as it seems in the States.
Yeah, I think a lot of Norwegian queer people as well have been more scared after seeing the situation in the US as well. So I feel like we have to like keep pushing and keep fighting to keep our rights, and also to have better rights as well, especially for trans people in the Norwegian context as well. But to end this episode on a more positive note, if we can try to do that, is there anything that gives you hope in this situation?
We are in our 40s, and I think one of the common tropes we hear often is that this younger generation isn't doing what we did, and they're this and they're that. But we are looking at the younger generation, and they are really stepping up to the plate, and they are fighting, and they are calling the reps and their senators, and they are going to protests. And that really warms the heart.
Yeah, the protest has been really nice. Also, during the Trump election, it would seem that the generation below us, Gen Z, at least the male portion of it, had voted in a much higher number than millennials had towards Donald Trump, which was concerning. But it seems to be that the immediate regret was faster, and that the generation holding itself accountable has been faster, and their willingness to talk to one another and change their opinions seems to be faster than a lot of the previous times. And some of that's probably information and things like that. But that's also good. It doesn't seem like they're as staunch in their opinions of things, that they can be changed and they can be motivated. I'm still worried that, and also this is not necessarily positive, but I guess it's kind of positive. The Trump administration and the people that are chosen do seem to be pretty incompetent. It may not matter. They may have so much power that it won't matter. But the good news is they aren't very good at what they're doing. They are not. They are kind of like failing forward. So that's kind of good. But it is really nice to see people coming out. So many people. The number may seem small, but most people have to work a ton of hours in the United States. They can't afford to even take off a Saturday. So seeing so many people come out is really helpful. Seeing the younger generations become more motivated and even change their own minds when they see they've made a mistake. That's been really nice to see. Yeah, my hope is mainly the states can get through this, and not, as I'm sure people outside of the states know, because we are insulated because we came inside of it. We knew that we impacted the world. We didn't realize how much we impacted the world until we left and got to hear about our country from other people. And we're like, why do they know so much about us?
Yes.
We hope that it doesn't it's obviously had an influence and rippled throughout the world in a negative way. And we hope that can not have so much that it causes a bunch of harm before it can correct itself.
Indeed.
But those things have been really positive and really good to see. And also just, again, a lot of judges that they love the law. And even if they hold conservative views, they are still believe in like protecting rights, even if they're things they don't believe in necessarily or want. They understand that there should be equal protections, and hopefully that continues.
Well, let's be hopeful and work for better times. And thank you so much for coming to our podcast.
Thank you for having us.
It was a pleasure, and nice to hear some personal experiences as well. Well, thank you. We will see you hear you in 2 weeks.
Okay. Takk skal du ha.
Thank you.
Takk for at du lyttet til denne episoden. Om du vil høre mer, så følg oss i din foretrukne podcast-app. Skeiv dagsorden er produsert av Thea Litschi og Skvette Andersen ved Senter for likestilling på Universitetet i Agder. Du kan lese mer om vårt arbeid på www.uia.no/senter for likestilling.
Musikk er laget av Mathias Leander Olsen. Episodene er redigert av Skvette Andersen. Foto er tatt av Knut Knudsen Eigeland, og det visuelle er laget av kommunikasjonsavdelingen ved UiA.